Okay, so we are in chapter 14. We're all the way at the bottom of the first page. That's page 60. And just for a little bit of background, this is the chapter that's talking to us about the fact that the Beinoni is an accessible condition. Meaning to say every one of us, with just a little bit of focus, with a little bit of attention, could, and therefore there's an implied message, should become a Beinoni. That's where we are in this chapter. And we started to explain how it is that every one of us is capable of reaching the status of Beinoni. And so last week we spoke quite a lot about a mental exercise that a person can have ready, prepared, any time that we feel that we're a little bit distracted, we feel that we might land up doing something which is contrary to what Hashem wants. All we need to do is activate this particular thought process, and that will keep us focused, will keep us on the straight and narrow, it will keep us doing what Hashem wants. Page 60 at the bottom of the page. And so effectively what we've learned so far is that in order for a person to successfully become a Beinoni, what is required is mind discipline. A little bit of mind discipline. So I need to have this ready, focused script that runs through my head, which basically says, I don't want to be a fool. That's where we left off last week. I don't want to be a fool. For a person to surrender the opportunity of connection to Hashem, that is a foolish thing to do. In fact, it's so radically unhealthy to do that even an individual who doesn't necessarily have any background in Judaism, any deep knowledge, any deep religious conviction, when they find themselves pushed against the wall, they will come out in support of their Judaism and not to lose their relationship with Hashem, rather than to do something which is, so to speak, a little distracting. So what the script has to say is, I don't want to be any less than that individual who, in last week's chapter we called Kal Shebekalim, the, so to speak, spiritual featherweight. I don't want to be any less than that person, and so I'm going to stand up and I'm going to do exactly what Hashem expects of me, even when I feel that I'm tempted, even when I feel that I'm distracted. That's where we left off last week. Now, here is critical information this week. The whole premise of the Beinoni idea is that any person is capable of training themselves to have this kind of script ready. In other words, every one of us is capable of training ourselves that as soon as we feel a pull towards something which is against what Hashem wants, we're going to activate the spiritual defense protocol, which is basically we're going to activate the script in our heads that says, I don't want to lose my relationship with Hashem. That's what we learned last time. However, what we have not yet clarified, and this is where we're going to focus this evening, is, so what then is the big difference between a Beinoni and a tzadik? Because most people will tell you that the definition of a tzadik in their minds is somebody who does exactly what Hashem wants and doesn't do anything which is contrary to what Hashem wants. That's how most people will understand it. Now we've said that's actually a Beinoni, and a Beinoni is something that is accessible to every single one of us, because any person can train their mind to have a healthy response to an unhealthy attraction. So what then is a tzaddik? That's where we're going to revisit again this week. Doesn't have the dilemma, right? So exactly. So the tzaddik does not have this dilemma. Now the question is, why not? How does a tzaddik not have this dilemma? What does it mean not to have the dilemma? Okay? So that's where we're going to start our conversation this evening. It is on the fourth last line on page 60, which is the very last word on that line. If you're having a look on the screen, it's almost exactly halfway down the page on the screen. Also, again, it's the last word on the line, bearing in mind that the last word of the line is an acronym. Mem, Shin, Aleph, Chof, which stands for Masha, Ein, Kain, which is a comparative word, basically saying what we're about to discover or discuss about the tzaddik is something completely different to the reality of the Beinoni. So let's have a look at what exactly makes it so different. Masha, Ein, Kain, Bedavar HaMosur Lelev. See, what we said till now is that if it's an exercise of the mind, meaning to say, if I've got to train myself to think a particular way, or I've got to train myself to have a script running in my head, that is accessible to any person. And I think it's really valuable for us to recognize that. Any person can train themselves to have a particular thought process that they can call on when they need it. Now, if you think this is far-fetched, imagine, for example, a person who is battling with anxiety. So we might tell that person, devise a script that any time that you're feeling anxious, use the script in your head. Whatever that is, things are going to turn out well, I'm in good hands. I don't know exactly what the particular wording is that you're going to use, but we can train a person and we can say to the person that you have to learn a particular methodology and apply this methodology in your mind, and that will help you to cope with a difficult situation. But that's not the case when we're talking about something that is a matter of the heart. So we're making a distinction now between things that are the matters of the mind and things that are matters of the heart. What's the expression that they use? Mind over matter, right? And there's that tongue-in-cheek version of it that says, what does mind over matter mean? If I don't mind, then it doesn't matter. In other words, if I decide that something's going to occupy space in my head, then it's going to occupy space. If I choose that it's not going to occupy, then it doesn't have to occupy space. The mind is a very controllable organ. And people often, unfortunately, sell themselves short because they don't believe that they're capable of this. But davar hamosur leleiv, when something is in the precinct of the heart, when something is the purview of the heart, that's not so simple. That's not so simple. What does that mean? So let's read on. Dahainu. That means, what does it mean? Something in the purview of the heart, page 60 at the bottom of the page. What does it mean? Something that's in the purview of the heart. So let's talk about it. The minute you hear the word heart, you expect that you must be discussing or describing an emotion. So let's throw out, when you hear the word emotion, let's throw out just literally the first emotions that come to mind. What are the first? Remember, we're talking obviously in the context of a person's spiritual development. We're talking about in the context of our relationship with Hashem. So what are the emotions, the first emotions that would come to mind in the context of your relationship with Hashem? What would you say? What emotions do you associate with your relationship with Hashem? Emotions. What emotions would you associate with your relationship with Hashem? Love. You have to love Hashem. Right? It's really simple. Love Hashem. What do you say? Awe. Right? To be in awe of Hashem, which is a far more mature version of the word that people often use, which is the word fear. Those are emotions. Now, is there a switch for emotions? Can you just like flip on in an emotion because it's required in this particular moment? Reminds me a little bit of Fiddler on the Roof, you know? Do you love me? Right? It's not that simple. You don't just flip the switch and now you feel the emotion. Okay? Interesting over here, somebody said desire. It's very interesting that you've said that desire is not technically considered an emotion. It's considered more like a primal drive than an emotion. An emotion implies that there's some level of maturity. Not every emotion has to be mature. But desire is not necessarily an emotion in the classical sense. Desire is associated with an emotion, and again, you're going to say that this is not an emotion, but we're going to describe it as an emotion, pleasure. So I feel pleasure. So the desire is the drive to get that pleasure. I feel love. I feel awe of Hashem, or if you want to use the word fear, if you prefer the word fear, even though it's a less mature version, right? Okay, so those are positive. Those are positive emotions, right? Now, can you think of a negative emotion? Because part of the way that I build a relationship with Hashem is to also build some kind of protection against things which are against what Hashem wants. So let's say if love is an emotion that builds my relationship with Hashem, can you think of an emotion? And when I use the word emotion, I'm using it quite liberally, and that's why maybe the word desire is actually not a bad word. Anything which you feel in your heart. So can you think of some kind of a heart response, some kind of an emotional response that would keep you away from doing something negative? Okay, so here somebody said shame. Fear. That's a good one. Fear. That's where fear is appropriate, right? What do you say?
Folly.
Folly. I don't know if folly is necessarily an emotion per se. It's a lack of intellectual focus, a lack of awareness, not necessarily an emotional experience. So fear is a very strong emotion that keeps us away from doing things that we shouldn't. Why do kids not put their fingers in the plug? Because they probably did it once before. Right? Why does a child not touch the hot stove? Because now there's a fear. And the fear is due to experience, because I did it once before and it was really painful. So now I'm afraid of doing it again. Or you don't do something because you're afraid of getting into trouble. You don't do something because you're afraid because of the shame that's associated with it, right? So there's another very, very powerful heart element. I'm saying heart element as opposed to emotion because we wouldn't immediately associate it as an emotion, and yet it's a very powerful emotive tool that we could use in order to be able to stop ourselves from doing something which is wrong, and that is disgust. Now, nobody thinks of it as an emotion, disgust, but the truth of the matter is it is. Okay, I just wanted
towards yourself.
We'll talk about that. So shame is disgust towards yourself. Disgust, independently of shame, is disgust towards a particular behavior or a particular item. Like, oh, gross. No, I don't mean negative. I'm saying it will stop me from doing something negative. In the same way as fear of something dangerous is not negative. Fear is a very healthy self-preservation thing that we've got to have in our lives, right? So, by the same token, disgust is something that it creates a barrier between me and something which I'm not supposed to do. Right, so very often you hear people say things like, you speak to them about non-kosher food and they say, oh, that's disgusting. Now, they don't necessarily mean that because they haven't necessarily even tasted it, so they don't even know necessarily if it is, tasty or disgusting. But just that attitude to say that is something which I find, disgusting, that's going to keep me away from it.
Rabbi, maybe abhorrent.
Same thing, yeah. Disgust, abhorrence. All kind of synonyms, right, for the same concept. Now, the reason I mention that is because that's actually where we're going to start our conversation over here this evening. Because in order for a tzadik to be a tzadik, which means in order for a person not to have all of the distraction and temptation and all of the issues that are so common in our lives, so the tzadik has to have davar hamosur lelev. The heart has to be aligned. Here's another interesting suggestion: hate. Hate is also a form of emotion, right? Hate is a form of emotion. You hate something. So I would say hate, despise, disgust, abhorrence, they're all kind of in the same continuum. That's it's the kind of thing that says, I don't want to go there. I don't want to get involved in that. I find it objectionable. So davar hamosur lelev, something which is in the control of the heart. Now, before we continue any further to read this inside, just one little question. And that is, but surely we've learned it previously, and it's going to be a big subject going forward, that the human being is designed in such a way that moyach sholit al alev b'tivoy, that by nature our mind can control our emotions. So here we're saying davar hamosur lelev, that there's certain things that are completely a matter of emotion, and making it sound like we can't use our minds to control that. And then at the same time we're saying, but the nature of a human being is that the mind can control the emotions. So I think it's really important to distinguish between these two things. These two principles. Let's say, and I'm going to leave the example right now outside of a Jewish example and just use a human example to start. Let's say that you decide you're going on diet. Nobody should please be offended that I'm using this example. It's not in any way a judgment of who's sitting in the room. So a person chooses to go on a diet. Part of the diet is, it's a Jewish diet. So what's a Jewish diet? I don't eat dessert except on Shabbos. The Jewish diet. I don't eat dessert except on Shabbos and Yom Tov and Simchas and Rosh Chodesh. So before you turn around, there's a whole lot of places. Okay, fine. First says, I'm not going to eat dessert. You come home after a rough day, and all you want is just to have a bar of chocolate because you feel that you need something to make you feel better after the day that you've had. Who wants the chocolate, your brain or your heart? So again, we're not talking about the fact that maybe there are other factors to the human being. We're just making this really simple. The fact that a person wants chocolate at the end of the day, is that driven by their objective understanding and appreciation of what's good in life? Or is it an impulsive requirement or feeling that this is going to make me feel better? Which one is it? Huh? Impulse. It's impulse. It's impulse. There is no objective value to that chocolate. I'm telling myself it's going to make me feel better, and we all know what happens. After the first row, I don't feel better. So I have the next row of the chocolate. and the next row. Why? Because objectively it actually doesn't make a difference. It actually doesn't help.
Between the first and second third one. It's a whole other story.
That's exactly 100%. There's a major self-reflection and whatever. Okay, but that's what happens. It's impulsive behavior.
And then you discuss it with yourself.
So now, exactly, and then you discuss with yourself, and you carry shame, right? That's how it works. That's exactly how it works. So now the question is, when I feel means the heart is driving this, that I want to have that piece of chocolate, can my brain stop me?
Yeah.
Of course it can, absolutely. That's called moyach shalit al alev. That is the foundational greatness of a human being, is that we are not the victims of our impulses. That we can at any time change direction. We can focus, we can be mature, we can remind ourselves, we can have a script that we've pre-prepared to say, I know I really would love to have chocolate, but I'll be much more satisfied by the fact that I lose a kilo by the end of the month or whatever it is, so therefore I'm not going to eat the chocolate. We can use our brains to stop our hearts from taking control. That's for sure. I want to know, can you? Question number one. And number two, is there any value in trying to use your brain to make chocolate disgusting? In other words, if you are a lover of chocolate, it's not going to work. Not only is it not going to work, it's a waste of time and energy.
Trying to trick yourself.
It's davar hamosur lelev. It's part of my emotional makeup that I happen to be one of these people who's a chocoholic. It's how the Lord designed me. I don't know. That's how I'm a chocoholic. So the value is that when that impulse strikes, I should use my brain not to be sucked into the impulse if it's not the appropriate time or place, or it doesn't fit my program of becoming healthier. But that doesn't mean I have to hate chocolate. That'd be ridiculous. Imagine if every time you went on a diet, you had to start hating food. Be ridiculous. Every time you want to save money, you'd have to feel disgusting because you spend something. That's not a requirement. So therefore, when over here we discuss this principle of what's called davar hamosur lelev, something which is in the purview of the heart, what are we talking about? The way that we are wired. Normal people enjoy food, and therefore they battle with self-control. We don't expect everybody to become abnormal. Okay? We expect everybody to be able to have control, so my normal self does not wreck my higher self. But you don't have to become abnormal. In other words, let's say that, let's use this example. Now it's no longer the example of a chocolate. Now it's the example of, there was a time in my life I didn't keep kosher, and now I keep kosher. Is there a requirement that now I should feel nauseous every time I see non-kosher food? Is that a requirement? Is that a requirement? Why?
Make life easier.
It make life easier, but is it a requirement? It's not a requirement. The fact of the matter is, just because something's not kosher doesn't mean it can't taste good or smell like it tastes good. I don't have to become some kind of an abnormal human being. Every other human being on the planet smells that particular smell and they think, I would love to have some. Me, I used to be kosher, now I smell it. Makes me want to, it's not a requirement.
But the act can disgust you.
Correct. The act can disgust me, and worse, my participation in the act can disgust me. That's fine. That's normal. But we're not expected to become abnormal human beings. We're not expected to become some kind of a mutant human who ordinary things make them feel sick to their stomach. So to be a Beinoni, I don't have to feel differently. I just have to respond differently. That's the premise of this chapter. Now we're comparing it back to a tzadik mashe einkein, the principle of what distinguishes a tzadik, which is bedavar hamosur lelev, that the tzaddik is not only somebody who has control over what they do, what they say, how they behave, but the greatness of the tzaddik is that the davar hamosur lelev, the things that are part of the emotional makeup of that tzaddik, that is, and he's going to give an example, dahainu, that means shi'ehei hora ma'us mamesh belev, that something which the Torah prohibits will make me actually be disgusted. That is not an expectation that Hashem has of ordinary people. or v'sonoi betachlis hasina, or that something which is against what Hashem wants should be something that I feel an absolute hatred for, or shaloi betachlis hasina, or even not an absolute hatred. Hine ze efsher she'iyeh be'emes la'mitoi. That is not something that a person can truly experience, ela al yedei goydel v'toykef ha'ava l'Hashem, unless that person has the most extreme, overwhelming love towards Hashem. It's at this moment that we probably have one of the clearest distinctions between the experience of the Beinoni and the experience of the Tzadik. The experience of the Beinoni is defined completely by how the Beinoni reacts to either temptation or distraction. The Tzaddik has no temptation or distraction because the Tzaddik feels completely differently. So let's understand this. What we're saying over here is, remember that this chapter has focused on what we could teach ourselves and how we could train ourselves to be able to stop ourselves from doing something which is not spiritually healthy. That's this whole chapter. Because remember, he started off this chapter by saying, midas ha-beinoni, midas kol adam, that the attribute of the Beinoni is accessible to every single one of us. And then he says, how so? Because every single one of us can train ourselves that when we are in a situation that we feel like doing something wrong, we can train ourselves not to do so. Now we're saying that is different to a tzaddik. Why? Because a tzaddik doesn't have to have that kind of a protocol in place. Let's put it slightly differently. There's an interesting Gemara. The Gemara tells us in the final chapter of Sanhedrin a whole long list of predictions of things that will happen just before Mashiach comes. And all of these predictions are supposed to be indicators. This is how you can identify that you're living in the Messianic age. It's a fascinating Gemara. I would highly recommend that you read it, especially when you try and identify things that are written in the Gemara from 1800 years ago and things that are happening right now in our world, and it's quite mind-blowing how some of them really line up. But that's subject for another conversation. One of the indicators that we're told that can identify you're living in the time of Mashiach is Yir'ei Chet Yimasu. That people who fear sin, right? Yir'ei Chet, people who fear sin, Yimasu, society will disregard them, or worse than it. Yimasu actually means that they'll be abhorred. They'll be, seen as disgusting by society. Now that does not sound like a very positive prediction, right? Can you imagine? Basically, it's describing that you're going to live in a time before Mashiach comes where if you have good values and you worry about doing the wrong thing, you don't want to do the wrong thing, society is going to effectively reject you. That's what it sounds like. And by the way, if you read it that way, it sounds like you're reading today's news. Right? Oh, you want to have values? We're going to cancel you. But there's another interpretation as well of what this means. Yir'ei Chet Yimasu, that before Mashiach comes, we'll have the opportunity to elevate ourselves to such a spiritual level that if people are still afraid of sin, we're going to look down our noses at them and say, that's very unimpressive that you're still afraid of sin. What does that mean? So let's do a little experiment, okay? Do a little experiment. Everybody has, well, not everybody, most people have their phobias, right? So what are common phobias? Probably the most common phobia is the fear of public speaking. It's probably the most common. Heights, flying, spiders, claustrophobia, right? Okay, but the most common. I think those are probably some of the most common phobias, right? Now, let me ask you a question. How common is it for a person to have a phobia of a color? How common is it? It exists. There is such a concept where people have a phobia of a particular color, right? So, how common? It's not common at all. So now, for example, if I had to right now bring into this room, right now, as we're sitting over here, if I had to bring in a big, bright green sheet,
No problem.
you'd be fine, right? Right? Okay, everybody be fine, right? Why? Why would you be fine?
Green's like the grass, I consider it.
Because nothing to be afraid of. There's nothing to be afraid of. It can't harm you. There's nothing to be afraid of. Why are people afraid of spiders? Because subconsciously there's this perception that the spider is going to hurt me. Right? So because I imagine that it could do me harm, that's why I'm afraid of it. Why is a person afraid of heights? Because they could fall. Claustrophobia, because I could suffocate. But you can understand where the basis, the subconscious basis of the fear comes from. Why would a person ever be afraid of a sin? No. Then you're afraid of the punishment. Why would a person ever be afraid of a sin? So that's a consequence. Why am I afraid of a sin? Why am I afraid of a spider? Because it could do something to me. Why would I be afraid of a sin? Because it could do something to me. In other words, if theoretically somebody came over to me and said, what? Let's say, okay, somebody came over to somebody in this room and said, listen, in one moment, someone's going to walk through that door. They are going to bring into this room a dish that you have never smelt anything that tastes as good as this. It is unbelievable. Nobody could resist it. This food is absolutely, nobody could resist it. I'm just warning you, the ingredients are not kosher. Are you going to feel nervous? Am I going to be able to? Yeah, it's a normal thing. Natural. Will I be able to control myself? I don't know. If somebody walks through the door right now and says, I'm bringing you a platter of mud. Make sure you don't eat it. Why would I be worried? What do I care? There's nothing in the world that's going to attract me to mud. I have no fear of mud because it can't harm me. It can't tempt me. It can't destroy me. Right?
To your point there, didn't you say that we're afraid of the spider because of the consequence? Not
Correct. But the fact is that it can harm me, right? It can only harm me if it can get... Agree. I'm saying it can only harm me if it can reach me. Right? If it can't get to me, it can't harm me. If the Avera cannot become part of my life, it can't harm me. Why do we have laws in Judaism about being alone with somebody from the opposite gender? The laws of Yichud. Why? Because the human nature is that humans can be tempted. Right? So you don't want to be in that environment. Right? So it actually asks this question. Halachically. So how come there's no law that says you can't be alone with an animal? Because the average person does not find that to be a challenge in their life. So, when the Gemara tells us that in the time before Mashiach, those who fear sin will be despised, the implicit message, at least according to some of the commentaries, is if you're still worried about a sin, then you're obviously not where you're supposed to be spiritually. So, we don't want to look at you. Okay, so are we holding that? No. What is a tzadik? That's a tzadik. Tzadik's not afraid of a sin. What's he afraid of? To him, the tray food is mud. There's nothing about it that is attractive. Nothing. To the contrary, it's actually despicable. This is what we call davar hamasur leleiv. This is something that has to do with your feelings about a particular area in life or a particular experience in life. You can't just wish to be there. I know many of us wish that we didn't have the same temptations that actually are part of our lives. We wish we had that kind of immunity where you look at something which is not allowed according to the Torah and you naturally feel bilious. Gee, that would be amazing. Can you imagine how frum everybody would be? Every time we saw something that isn't aligned with the Torah. Right? Question. Why does a person have a phobia of public speaking if it can't hurt you? Absolutely can hurt you. Because you can get up in front of everybody and you can say something that either doesn't come out right or that whatever, and you can embarrass yourself terribly. That's exactly why people have the fear of public speaking. Whereas somebody who is completely good, and not only good, exceptional at speaking, they're not going to have the phobia because it can't hurt them. But for the average person, when they're going to get up, they're going to speak publicly, they're worried that there's a lot of risk over here, there's a lot of exposure, and therefore could hurt them. Anyhow, so coming back to our point, so the core of our point is that whether or not I'm going to have that rejection, that natural rejection of something that the Torah forbids, that is not up to me. It's not. Davar hamasur leleiv. It's something which is wired into the nature of the heart, the emotional makeup of the person. That is not something that I can switch on and off at will. Can't do that. So therefore, I need a So therefore that helps me to distinguish why a tzadik is in a completely different category. Now there's another layer to this. And that is that earlier, and you asked me why I said this, earlier we referred to either disgust or fear as negative, right? Even though the outcome is something positive, because if I fear or I'm disgusted by something which is unhealthy, it's going to keep me away from it. That's actually a good thing. So that's why people will tell you that fear is very important for human survival. If we didn't have fear, we'd land up in all kinds of dangerous situations. And yet at the same time, fear, what it does to us biologically, is not necessarily healthy for us, right? So why is it a negative? Because you can't be driven by fear, you can't be driven by loathing, you can't be driven by disgust. You always have to be driven by something positive. And especially here, if we're talking about a tzaddik, surely the tzaddik must be driven by something positive. So in order to understand this, let's just pause for one moment in this conversation, and let's talk about another conversation for one moment. Have you ever heard, and please don't name anybody, have you ever heard of a couple who absolutely loves each other and completely mistreats each other? Have you ever heard of such a thing? You'd be surprised how common it is. Basically, I love my wife, I love my husband, I love my child, I love my parent, I love whoever it is. I love them absolutely. And yet, when we stand there objectively watching how they behave and how they interact, there's a lot of taking advantage, disrespect, etc., taken for granted, right? Somebody's saying here, Adam and Eve. I don't know if Adam and Eve is an example. We have no information in the Torah of their emotional connection. The Torah doesn't go down that route. So I don't know if we can use Adam and Eve as an example. But it's not that uncommon that you have people who go on and on and on about how much, I love my children more than anything else, yeah? So how come it is that every time your child's talking to you on your phone? How come? I love my wife, absolutely, I love my wife, she's the most amazing person in the world. Okay, if that's the case, how come you never spend any time with her? You know, you're out here, you're playing golf, you're at a business meeting, you're at this and that, but how come? Because the way that you know that there's very deep love is when that love also experiences an element of fear. For example, God forbid somebody who we love is hurt or ill. The fear that overtakes us about what could happen is a stronger indicator of love than even the love is. Because what happens with love, sometimes we get so caught up in whatever it is that we're doing that we forget about love. But when somebody throws this possibility at us that, God forbid, the one that we love is in peril, then we become so afraid of what could happen to that relationship that the response is even stronger than the love response. And what that tells me is that there really is a deep love over there. Because if there wasn't a deep love, I wouldn't respond with such a fiery response, or such a desperate response, or such a despairing response. So effectively what that tells you is that love and fear are two sides of a coin, in the same way as love and loathing are two sides of a coin. I'll explain to you what I mean by that. If we love somebody dearly, then the likelihood is if somebody hurts them, we are going to be so negatively disposed to that person who hurt them that we might even surprise ourselves at the aggression with which that emotion pours out. I never knew I had it in me, right? I never knew that I could be so angry. I never knew that I could be so disgusted. When a person truly, truly loves something or someone, then they will naturally be sickened by anything that opposes or hurts it. The tzaddik has such a profound love of Hashem that anything which suggests some kind of rebellion against Hashem makes the tzaddik sick. How could that even be? How could such a thing even exist? So for us, if we see a cheeseburger, we think, wow, I wonder what that tastes like. Or maybe some people don't have to wonder, right? I know what it tastes like. And I know that it's actually nice. And I know that I'm not allowed to have it, in spite of the fact that it really tastes nice. And in fact, I'm not allowed to have it. The tzaddik looks at the cheeseburger and says, I love Hashem so much. And this is something that potentially could drive a wedge between a person and Hashem. I find it sickening that such a thing exists. So what now does he have to say? And I'm going to have self-control and not eat it. Now, where the self-control? It makes you feel sick. Davar ha-mosur lelev. The nature of the tzaddik is that those factors that are completely within the scope of the human emotional response are real emotions. He doesn't have to remind himself. He doesn't have to have a ploy. He doesn't have to have a script. He doesn't have to have a cue card that he pulls out when he's feeling, oops, maybe I wanted to. It sickens him that such a thing still exists. How could the world tolerate something which interferes with Hashem's objectives? So that is the key of what a tzaddik is. A tzaddik is driven by love of Hashem. A Beinoni is driven by compliance. Of course, a Beinoni also wants to have love of Hashem, but the Beinoni is working on that love of Hashem. The tzaddik is driven by love of Hashem. Now, depending on what kind of a tzaddik they are, because we've already discussed previously in chapter 10, that there's what we call a tzaddik gomer, a complete tzaddik, and we have a tzaddik she'eno gomer, an incomplete tzaddik. And we said that the distinction between them is that the complete tzaddik has absolute hatred for anything which is contrary to what Hashem wants, and the incomplete tzaddik has some degree of hatred, loathing, whichever word you want to use, for anything which is contrary to what Hashem wants. So I'm deliberately, by the way, ignoring a question that came up over here about whether a tzaddik is born with a birth defect, because we're going to discuss whether a tzaddik is born this way, whether they develop. We're going to get to that. I don't believe we're going to get there today, but no, it's just how the question came up. Is the tzaddik born with a birth defect? But we're going to get to that, but it's not going to be tonight. We're going to talk about whether the tzaddik is born this way or not. Okay, so that's why I'm deliberately ignoring it for now. But let's read what he says in here. So he has what drives the tzaddik to have this absolute no exposure, no susceptibility to something which is against what Hashem wants, because he finds it completely objectionable and abhorrent, and it makes him angry, etc. That's because of the great and powerful Hashem, love towards Hashem that he has. And the love towards Hashem that he has is called bevachinas ahava beta'anogim. It is called love that is in the realm of pleasure. Le'yisanegal Hashem me'ein olam haba, to have pleasure from Hashem, and that in itself is a taste of the world to come. Now, before we explain what that is, I want to just read a little bit further to get to the next piece, because it's relevant, and then we'll put it all together, and that's how we'll wrap up for this evening. V'azeh amru razal. It's in this context of a person who has this experience that our sages say oilamcha tir'eh b'chayecha chulei, that it is possible for a person to see their world in their lifetime. Oilamcha, your world, tir'eh b'chayecha, you will see in your lifetime. Now we have to unpack what that means. Ve'ein kol adam zoiche lozeh. Not everybody has this experience. Kizeu ke'ein kibul schar, because this is more of a reward than an achievement. Like the pasuk says, "Avodas matona etenes kunaschem v'goymer." Hashem says, "I will give you an avoda, a service of a gift," and that is commotion is something that the Alter Rebbe will explain elsewhere in greater detail. Okay, so let's understand. When we speak about love of Hashem, we understand that it is a positive mitzvah to have love of Hashem. We say it in our davening daily during the Shema. Ve'ahavta es Hashem elekecha, that you have to love Hashem your God, b'chol lavav, b'chol nafshecha, v'chol moedecha, with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your might. So we know that it's a positive mitzvah in the Torah. The Rambam, in Hilchos Yesodei HaTorah, in his laws of the foundational principles of Torah, after he tells us that there's a mitzvah to know God, which he calls the first mitzvah, then the next two mitzvahs are to love Hashem and to have awe of Hashem. So now the big question is, and many of the commentators ask this question, how can you instruct somebody how to feel? How can you tell me who to love? It sounds like some kind of a medieval dating ritual. This is who you're going to love. What does it mean? How can you tell me who to love? So the explanation that is given by the Rambam and by others is that when a person focuses their mind and contemplates on Hashem's greatness and recognizes the blessings that Hashem gives them in their life, it's only natural that that will precipitate a love towards Hashem, like anything or anyone else. Right? As you get to know somebody, as you get to appreciate them, as you see the value that they bring to you in your life, so it develops a love towards that individual, and so it's no different with Hashem. That is what we call ahavas oilam, the love of this world, which we actually say in our davening, right? Ahavas oilam. We say that we've got this love that Hashem has given us, so to speak, as a means of access to Him. And basically what that means is that any person with a little bit of focus and a little bit of investment and a little bit of effort is capable of reaching a point where you feel some degree of love towards Hashem. And that love will prompt you to do the things that Hashem wants, because that's how it works. When I care about somebody, when I love somebody, when I want to build relationship with somebody, that's when I'm going to do the things that person wants. Then there's a higher level of love, which is called ahava rabbah. Ahava rabbah is the great love of Hashem. And that means when a person is so invested in their spiritual development and their contemplation and meditation on Hashem's greatness, that now not only do they just feel, I love Hashem to the extent that I want to do what Hashem expects of me, but now the person becomes so driven by this love of Hashem that they actually want to do more than what is expected. They're kind of throwing themselves, boots and all, completely into whatever it takes to connect to Hashem, so to speak, at all costs. Now, both Ahavas Olam, or as it's sometimes called Ahava Zuta, the minor love, and Ahava Rabbah, the more mature, advanced love, those are things that we develop through our efforts. And now, in this piece, he's talking about something called Ava B'Ta'anugim, love, which is the love of pleasure. Now remember, Ava and love is normally the seeking of, right? The seeking of connection, the seeking of pleasure, the seeking of relationship. Ava B'Tanugim is where I have so much pleasure that therefore I love the individual because they bring me so much pleasure. So Ava B'Tanugim is where a person reaches such a level of dedication to Hashem, such a level of connection to Hashem, that the only thing, and this is the key, that the only thing in their life that gives them pleasure is Hashem. Nothing else counts. Not good food, not holidays, not money, not clothing, not other relationships, not recognition. The only thing that gives me pleasure is Hashem. That's all I care about. That is the tzadik's reality. And that, he says, is a gift that Hashem gives an individual after they've worked so hard and they've invested so much in developing a relationship with Hashem. They've done, so to speak, the most that a human being is capable of doing, and then Hashem gives them this gift. It's considered Olam Chatire Bechayecha. You're already experiencing the world to come while you're still alive. Hashem is giving you a gift of something which is completely outside of the ordinary. That's where the tzaddik lives. Because the tzaddik only loves Hashem, therefore anything else is to the tzaddik a barrier, an aberration, a distraction, something that is objectionable, and so therefore the tzaddik doesn't have the problem of having to self-control. Why would he self-control? The only thing he cares about, the only thing he loves is Hashem. So that's really the distinction that we wanted to make over here between a Beinoni and a tzaddik. A Beinoni has a lot of personal work still to do, constantly being vigilant, always making sure not to go down the rabbit hole of things that seem very attractive, and in order to do that he teaches himself certain methods that he uses which protect him. The tzaddik doesn't have any of those issues because all he cares about and the only thing that could possibly give him pleasure is godliness and nothing else. With that introduction, next week, please God, we can talk about whether a tzaddik is born or made.
You just answered it.